Hi everyone. This video is a simple guide to how researchers study non-religious people, who does this research, what questions they ask, and what conclusions they reach. If you've been following my channel, you know I already have a whole series on the history of atheism and non-religion, but one thing I haven't covered yet is the story of how the scientific field of secular studies itself has grown and changed over time. And that's exactly what we are diving into today. We'll explore where it all began, how it's evolved, and what's going on right now. So in this overview, I'm not just going to talk about the history of how the study of non-religion developed in the social sciences and where it might be heading in the future. I'll also share practical tips, where to find reliable information, which books and articles to read, and which authors to pay attention to. If you're interested in atheism, secularism, or non-religion, please watch until the end. This video was inspired by a recent article written by sociologists Ryan Cragun and Bethany Gall. In their article, they raise a really important and honestly pretty serious issue. There is still a huge gap in the research when it comes to non-religious people. We still know very little about their lives, beliefs, and values. And because of that, in many countries, these people face lots of prejudice and stereotypes. Non-religious folks are often seen as immoral, cold, or like they don't have values. But that's just not true. In fact, in some countries, secular people already make up the majority of population, and more people are consciously choosing a non-religious lifestyle. But there is also a darker side to this. In some parts of the world, living religion or openly identifying as non-religious is treated as a crime, and it can come with serious punishment. The authors of the article point out that it's really only in the 21st century that scholars finally started seriously studying non-religious people. Before that, most of the attention went to religious groups, and non-religious folks were either ignored completely or portrayed in a negative light. In psychology, researchers say that atheism is an understudied topic in psychological science, and it's not just psychology. Anthropologists of non-religious have pointed out that anthropologists have long excluded the secular from their analysis, and are now calling for more research into what they call lived non-religion. So things are starting to change. More and more researchers in sociology, psychology, anthropology, and other fields are trying to understand non-religious people from their own perspective. Alright, now let's talk about the history of studying non-religious people. You might think that scientists only recently started looking into folks who don't believe in God or anything supernatural, but of course secular and even openly anti-religious people existed long before the 20th century. I've actually covered quite a few of them in other videos on this channel. Links are in the description. The real issue was this. For a long time, social scientists just weren't very interested in how people drift away from religion. I'm talking about the personal journey, how exactly they lose faith and what they believe in afterward. Back in the 19th century, philosophers like Auguste Comte, Max Weber, and Jean-Marie Guyot talked about something we now call secularization on a big society-wide scale. The idea was, as societies get more complex and modern, religion would naturally fade away. But those were mostly theories, not real in-depth studies of individual people's experiences. So the first real step toward that came in 1916, when an American psychologist, James Leuba, decided to find out how religious American scientists actually were. He ran a survey and discovered that about 60% of them didn't believe in God. That was a huge shock at that time. Then, starting in the 1940s, Gallup began regularly asking Americans about their faith and religious affiliation. That's when researchers could finally track how many people were non-religious in the country. But it wasn't until the 1960s and 70s that we saw the first proper studies focused on people who didn't belong to any religion. In 1968, sociologist Glenn Vernon pointed out that we knew almost nothing about them, and said that studying them could teach us a lot. He even suggested calling them nones, from the word non. Around the same time, J. Demirov from the University of Massachusetts did a small study of two tiny groups of non-believers. In 1971, British sociologist Colin Campbell made one of the first big attempts to explain especially those who were openly critical of religion, and then almost nothing. From the 70s until the early 2000s, the topic barely came up. The studies that did appear in the 80s and 90s often painted non-religious people in a pretty negative light. They'd compare them to the religious majority and basically ask, what's wrong with these lost souls? Labels like apostate or unchurched were thrown around as if to show how much worse or morally corrupt they supposedly were compared to believers. But there were exceptions. For example, psychologist Gordon Allport found in his research that non-religious people were often less prejudiced, better educated, and more likely to help those in need than religious people. Also in the 90s, Canadian psychologists Altmaier and Hansberger studied believers and non-believers in a pretty fair, balanced way. By the way, I've done a whole video review of their book, and please check it out if you haven't seen it yet. Still, even with the work of Allport, Altmaier, Hansberger, and a few others, the mainstream scientific picture was dominated by negative stereotypes. As Cragun and Hammer have shown, late 20th century studies almost always had a bias. They approached non-believers with suspicion, as if non-believing in God was automatically odd, suspicious, or even a problem. Being religious was considered normal, non-believing? That was treated like a red flag. But over time things started to change. From around the 2000s, sociologists stopped seeing non-religious people as deviation from the norm and started treating them like anyone else, people with valid worldviews, just different from religious ones. They began actually listening to non-religious voices, studying how they live, what they value, and what they believe. That shift was huge. Now secular people are seen as just another part of society with their own culture, morality, and way of life. But it's not all smooth sailing. Even with all these positive shifts, in some countries and cultures, atheist and secular people are still viewed with suspicion, especially where religion has a strong grip on politics and everyday life. In those places, living religion can still get you labeled as immoral or dangerous, which of course is just a stereotype. Like I said earlier, the real turning point in research only came in the 21st century. That's when we finally started seeing serious studies about this topic. Sociologists Phil Zuckerman and J.C. Smith were among the first to dig into the why. Why do people leave religion? What pushes them to take that step? And how do they build a new secular identity? Or they simply studied those who were secular all the time. Their work really kicked things off. It inspired an entirely new field, secular studies, or the study of non-religion. Today there are hundreds of researchers all over the world working in this area. We've especially gotten a ton of data from the US, Canada, and the UK. For example, Crystal Manning studied how non-religious parents raise their kids without God but with strong values. Now she's doing another important work. She's looking into how secular people face and prepare for death. Other researchers like Semina and Smith wrote about the so-called atheist awakening. Later, people like Ledru, Cragun, Manning, and Fazino and Blankholm showed how non-religious people form communities, build a kind of movement, and support one another. Probably the deepest work so far, at least when it comes to understanding what it means to become a secular person in America, has been done by Stephen Bullivant, Ryan Cragun, and Jesse Smith. By the way, I've got a review of their latest book on my channel. Check it out if you haven't yet. And honestly, this is just the beginning. I'm pretty sure that in the coming years, this branch of social science is only going to grow. And if you are into this topic, I've got a bunch of great resources to share with you. But first, there is something important I want to say. Like I mentioned earlier, this field of research is still pretty young. Some people even criticize it, saying it's dominated by a small group of white men from Western universities who look at the world through a narrow lens, especially when it comes to understanding what's happening far from their own countries. But things are starting to change. We're hearing more voices from women and minority groups. There is new research focusing on non-religious people from sexual and racial minorities, African Americans, indigenous people in Canada and New Zealand, like the Inuit and Maori, even studies about the stigma faced by working-class non-believers. There are studies in sociology and anthropology about so-called lived non-religion in different parts of the world. We're seeing works on non-religious people in North Africa, the Middle East, Iran, India, China, Thailand, Korea, Latin America, and many other regions. And the best part? A lot of this research is being done by people who actually come from those places. Here are some examples, and in my future videos I'll be talking about them more. In fact, I'm currently working directly with some of these authors on a joint project. My colleague Phil Zuckerman and I have a contract with Oxford University Press. We're putting together a handbook on how people from different regions and social groups live religion or religious belief. When it's published, I'll definitely review the latest findings from these researchers. But I'll be honest, this field still isn't as diverse as it should be. We need more research on non-religion in the so-called Global South. For example, what is it like to become a former Jain, a Buddhist, Sikh, or someone who practiced shamanism and then became a materialist? We don't have much on that yet. It's a big gap. The good news is more and more projects are starting to cover these topics worldwide, including my own work. The field is growing fast, and every year we're getting more data. That said, there is still a big debate about methodology. How do you actually count the number of secular people in the world? It's not easy. In some places, it's not safe to say you are an atheist or secular, especially in countries where religion and politics are tightly connected, like some Muslim majority or authoritarian states. And religious can mean totally different things depending on the culture. In some countries, people call themselves religious just because it's part of national identity, even if they don't believe in God or go to church. Think Norway or Finland. In others, someone might say they aren't religious, but still take part in rituals, celebrate holidays, believe in fortune-telling or magic, like in Japan or China. But there, that's seen as tradition, not religion. That's why for researchers it's tricky to figure out where culture ends and religion begins, which categories to use, and how to actually measure the size of the secular population. And one of the most powerful ideas that Cragun and Gall share is this: living religion isn't just about stop believing. It is a deeper transformation, a process, a personal journey. In fact, they even call it a kind of conversion to secularism or secular conversion. Yes, a conversion, because when someone lets go of their old religious worldview, they often start looking for new answers to big questions. How should I live? How do I raise my kids without religion? How do I celebrate weddings or say goodbye to loved ones? These are real, meaningful questions, and the answers aren't always easy to find. That's why Cragun and Gall say we shouldn't just look at this as leaving something behind, but also as embracing something new. And now researchers are beginning to notice certain shared traits or values among secular people, patterns that show up again and again. Actually, there is a really interesting recent article by Blankholm and his colleagues that talks about this, and I'm planning to make a future video review about it, so stay tuned. These days, in many developed countries, more and more people call themselves atheists, agnostics, or just non-religious. And yeah, in recent years, there has been a lot of research on why and how people live religion and what influences that process. But here is the surprising part. We still know very little about what people believe after they leave religion. What are their values now? How do their views change? What new habits do they pick up? How does their behavior shift once they step away from faith? How do they build relationships after that, and so on? These are huge parts of human life, but science hasn't studied them much yet. We don't have a lot of systematic data, and the research we do have often focused on a very narrow group of people. Many countries and cultures haven't really been included at all. This is exactly what Cragun and Gall's article talks about. They believe that in the future we'll see a lot more research like this, simply because the number of non-religious people in the world keeps growing. And it's not enough just to say, oh, they exist. We need to understand how they live and what matters to them. Alright, let's break this down. What does secular conversion even mean? Sounds fancy, but here is the simple version. It's when a person leaves their religious beliefs behind and starts seeing life from a more secular, meaning non-religious, point of view. And this isn't usually some quick flip of a switch. For a lot of people, it's a long, deeply personal process. Sometimes they talk about it openly to family, friends, whoever will listen. Other times they keep quiet for years, either because they are afraid of judgment or they don't want the extra drama. Or, as my research suggests, often they simply don't want to hurt the feelings of their friends and family members. And when someone leaves religion, they often go through a rethinking phase first. Okay, so what do I believe now? What actually matters to me? And then comes building a whole new set of worldviews, values, and often finding a new community where they actually feel comfortable. And researchers have a bunch of different names for this process. Some call it a religious exit, meaning a complete break from religion. There is also the term dance, meaning secular converts are done with religion. Another term you might hear is deconversion or deconstruction from faith. Basically the undoing of the previous religious conversion. Like there was a moment when someone believed, but later they realized that just isn't me anymore and stepped away. And here is a story I love. When I was interviewing former clergy, one pastor told me something that stuck with me. I know exactly the person who gave me my faith. For me, faith like an object, something you can hand over like a book. I took it, lived with it for a while, and then I realized I didn't need it anymore, so I gave it back. That's such a powerful metaphor, right? But here is where it gets interesting. Sociologists Cragun and Gall point out that the word deconversion, meaning leaving the faith, isn't the best choice. Why? Because it makes it sound like conversion to religion is some big special thing, and leaving it is just undoing that step. But in reality, both are actually similar processes. A person is just changing their worldview. And sometimes scholars also use the word apostasy, and those who leave religion get called apostates. But that word isn't perfect either. In many religious settings, it comes across as an insult, like you turned your back on us, you betrayed the faith. And it's usually a label someone else puts on you, not something people call themselves. Plus, apostasy doesn't always mean leaving religion altogether. Sometimes it just means switching from one religion to another. So using it as if it only means living for a secular life isn't exactly accurate. That's why these days a lot of researchers avoid using words like deconversion or apostate altogether. And you've probably noticed that so far I've been talking about people who stop being religious. But I want to be very clear that it's not just about leaving religion. A lot of people were never religious in the first place. For generations, their families just haven't been into religion, or they've always been indifferent to it, so there is nothing for them to quit. And the number of these people is growing every year. They're just as important to study, their lifestyle, how their values are shaped, all of that. So looking at this group is also part of secular studies research. Alright, now if you want to dig deeper into this topic, I've put together a little starter pack of resources for you. First up, academic journals that focus on secular studies. Two worth bookmarking are Secularism and Nonreligion and the Secular Studies Journal. Tons of solid research papers there. Another one I highly recommend is the Non-Religion and Secularity Research Network. It's an international interdisciplinary network of researchers founded back in 2008. It was founded to bring together and centralize studies on non-religion and secularity and to keep the conversation moving forward. On their site, you'll find lots of resources, research papers, event listings, lectures, and seminars. Every 2 years, they host an international conference, and the next one is happening September 8 in Bratislava, Slovakia. I also recommend checking out this book series. A similar project is based at the University of Ottawa in Canada. It's called Non-Religion in a Complex Future. This is also an international research project. They are looking at the social impact of the rapid growth of non-religion. They've got researchers from Canada, Australia, Brazil, Argentina, various European countries, and the US. Their YouTube channel already has over 80 videos where the authors share their findings, definitely worth subscribing to. On their website, you can also check out a list of the most interesting and important publications in secular studies. Okay, another key project is Explaining Atheism. It was a 3-year program from 2022 to 2024 run by Queen's University Belfast in partnership with other universities. On their site, you'll find a ton of resources and publications. The goal was to figure out why and how some people become atheists and why the percentage of atheists is higher in some countries than others. They also have a YouTube channel where you can actually see the vibe of these conferences and what kind of topics get discussed. Plus, they teamed up with the amazing channel Religion for Breakfast to produce a 10-episode video series on atheism. 3 episodes are out already, so you can start binging those now. Also, if you attend academic conferences like the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion or the American Academy of Religion, you'll find discussion groups and panels that bring together researchers who focus on non-religion. Another cool resource is the International Society for Historians of Atheism, Secularism, and Humanism. It was founded back in 2014 by Nathan Alexander and Elliot Hanofsky. They hold annual conferences too, and their website is packed with useful resources, plus a list of works published by members on these topics. And by the way, the co-founder, Nathan Alexander, runs an amazing podcast called Beyond Atheism. Together with his co-host, he regularly invites top researchers on non-religion and dives deep into some really fascinating conversations about secularism. Also, Nathan's book on how atheists view race in the 19th century was actually one of the first books in the Secular Studies series from New York University Press. And I highly recommend checking out all the books from that series. And of course, you can already find reviews of some of these books on my channel. In fact, I've got tons of content on secular studies here. So definitely check out my playlist. I'll leave a link in the description. Now, there is one more book I just have to recommend. It's edited by Teemu Taira, and I've mentioned it on my channel several times. Honestly, if you want a solid introduction to the study of non-religion, this is a fantastic place to start. Teemu Taira did an incredible job bringing together some of the best experts in the field, and the way they explain things, super clear, no dry academic jargon, just straight up understandable. The structure is really clever too, 64 questions about atheists and 64 short but insightful answers. You'll learn who atheists are, where they have spiritual experiences, where they get their values from, what atheist religions are, and plenty more. Seriously, highly recommend it. So to wrap things up, thanks to Phil Zuckerman, you can now actually get a degree in secular studies if you want. Because Pitzer College has a whole program for that. Pretty cool, right? And also you can apply to grad school at a bunch of universities and say your focus will be on researching non-religion. These days many programs are welcome to this. For example, in Estonia, at the University of Tartu, they advertised 3 fully paid 4-year PhD positions, and they were welcoming candidates specifically to study non-religion. In other words, there are programs that literally pay you to do your PhD research on non-religion. And honestly, this is just the beginning. I'm sure that in the future more and more countries will have university programs seriously studying secularism, both in the social sciences and the humanities. We might even see some religious studies departments rebranding themselves as departments of religious and secular studies. So if you are a student or planning to go to university and this topic sparks your interest, know that this kind of research is already happening. You could totally make a career out of it. And one important reminder, which I've mentioned before in my videos, you don't have to be an atheist or a non-religious person to study this topic, just like you don't have to be a member of a new religious movement to study one. Many scholars who write about this are themselves religious. So thanks for watching. Huge thanks to those few who support me financially, whether it's through Patreon, YouTube membership, or one-time PayPal donations. It really means a lot to me. If I missed anything, drop it in the comments. I'd be happy to add more sources and ideas to the video description. Wishing you all peace and health wherever you are.